We're going to use finches to start to talk about how we see traits being inherited and a little bit about how we can tell what to expect in our next generation. So we're going to use these finches. We're going to use beak length as our trait, and I'm going to assign that letter B for beak length. So we're going to be using the letter B, so either capital B or lowercase b, to represent beak length. And I've got two beak lengths to choose from, a long beak or a short beak. So there's no medium beak. You're either long or a short beak finch. So we're going to pretend that our finches have 3 pairs of chromosomes, and they're all homologous pairs. So take a moment, try to remember what it means to be a homologous pair of chromosomes. And then where did these chromosomes come from? So where did these 3 pair come from for this particular finch? We're going to be looking closely at pair number 1. And we're going to say that it codes for beak length right down here. So remember, your chromosome is just super tightly wound DNA. So it's wound up super, super tight. And that a gene is just a region of DNA that codes for a protein. So we're going to say that this is the region of that tightly coiled DNA. So if you uncoiled it, this would be the region of DNA that would code for the protein that would then affect how long the beak was. And we're going to take a closer look at that chromosome pair number 1, and we're going to pretend that we've unraveled this section of DNA, and we can look at the actual base pairs that make up each of those traits. So we're going to look at the long allele first, and I've unraveled this section of DNA, and I see that the code is ATCGCCTACG. And then if I unravel the other allele, I can see that the code is instead ATCGCATACG, and that these codes are very similar except for in one place. And it just so happens that this one place caused a variation that changed the length of the beak. And so we've got 2 different codes that are coding for 2 variations of beak length. And so that observable trait, being able to see that beak length, is known as the phenotype. So phenotype is the observable trait. So in this case, I have 2 different codes, which give me 2 different variations of beak length. So those are alleles. So they're both code for beak length, but this allele codes for a long beak, and this allele codes for a short beak. Now, when I'm talking about phenotypes and what things look like, you have to remember that we inherit 2 copies. So we might get long, or we might get short, or we might get a long, short. And sometimes one trait will mask the effects of the other. So that's where we get into words like dominant and recessive. So dominant is explaining the idea, or it is defining a allele where when you have just one copy of it, that one copy is enough to mask the effects of the other allele. And generally, when we're talking about something that is dominant, we give it the capital letter. So it will get the capital version, and so in this case, it would be big B. Recessive alleles, on the other hand, require 2 copies of the allele to be inherited in order to observe the effects. That means that this is the allele that could get masked if there were a dominant allele, and normally we use lowercase to represent a recessive allele. So that would be like little b. So in this case, so far I don't know if long beak or short beak, which one of those is recessive and which one's dominant. All I know is that they both exist, and it's possible that you can inherit the long beak allele or the short beak allele. So let's take a look at our possible variations. And we're going to start with finch number 2 down here. And finch number 2 is really important. So in this particular example, the finch has inherited one long version of the gene and one short version of the gene. So when you inherit one of each, this is known as a heterozygous or heterozygote. So that means that you've inherited one of each allele. So in this case, one long beak allele and one short beak allele. So you have gotten one of each. Now, this one's really important to look at because if I look at a finch that inherited the long allele and the short allele, and then I look at the phenotype that I see that I see a long beak come from this bird. So that must mean that the long allele is masking the effects of the short allele. That means that the long allele is dominant. Because the long allele is dominant, I'm going to give it the big B. Big B is referring to long. And then the short allele is now going to be little b, because short in this case is recessive. And I only know that when I'm looking at the heterozygote. All right, so now that I know which one is the dominant one and which one's the recessive one, I'm going to go ahead and take a look at my other finches. So here's finch number 1. In this particular case, this finch inherited a long allele and another long allele. So if it inherits long and long, of course its beak is also going to be long. And so yes, its beak is long because that is what I would expect. When both parents pass down the long beak allele, this bird is known as homozygous, or a homozygote, which just means that they got two of the same. And in this case, you could be even more specific. You could say that it was a homozygote for the dominant allele. I'm going to actually write this as homozygous dominant. So this bird is homozygous dominant. My third finch, my last finch, in this case inherited short allele, and its phenotype, of course, is short because it only inherited short alleles. And since it inherited two of the same alleles, it is also known as a homozygous or homozygote. But in this case, it's going to be a homozygous recessive. It's homozygous for the recessive trait. And in that case, I would write it as little b. And I forgot to write up here the homozygous dominant is going to be big B. And that just shows the alleles that they inherited. So genotype is our allele combination. So this bird got long. Being a heterozygote just means you got one of each. So it got a long and a short. And homozygous recessive means it just got both recessive traits. So in this case, that would be short. So we'll look at other examples in class. I hope these notes are helpful.